Perfect. Okay, well, I would love to welcome everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our virtual speaker series. My name is Jennifer Magnuson, and I am behind the scenes administration for NAME. I do a lot of the communication and the website, and you might recognize my name from some of the emails that go out to our membership. We've been doing these virtual talks since COVID shut us down in 2020, and we're happy to be continuing them to this day to help our members connect with each other because our member region is really large because it covers Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. And so over the last couple months, Gloria has been amazing at finding us some really neat speakers. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gloria to introduce tonight's speaker. And then we'll kick off from there. We will have a question and answer session at the end, and I'll be happy to help facilitate that. And so throughout the talk, if you have any questions, just jot them down, and at the end, we'll take questions from the chat, or if you would like to unmute and ask questions on camera, you're welcome to do that too. But at this point, I would like to turn it over to Gloria.
Okay, and before I introduce Brian, I just want to mention that I've been corresponding with Josh McInes, who is going to be doing was scheduled to be doing the next Zoom talk on orcas. But Josh has sent me an email saying that he regrets, but he has been called off to Central California to a research ship, and he is going to be collecting new data on offshore orcas and seabirds, their habitats and behaviors. So even though he's having to postpone this to January 14th, he will come back with brand new, hot off the press information. And he also has new information about southern resident orcas. So that should be a really good talk. So for tonight, though, it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Timmer, who I must say, when I Googled you on the internet, I was quite impressed with how many scholarships and bursaries you've received over the years. You're pretty, you don't really brag about yourself, but you have a lot of scholarships to your name. And the only one I'll mention is from the University of Victoria, the President's Research Scholarship. So that's a really prestigious award. I think it's important to mention that Brian he has connections to the Salish Sea through his Stolo First Nations ancestry. So you have that connection, which is, of course, thousands and thousands of years old. And so I think that's really wonderful. Brian is also a scuba diver. In fact, he teaches scuba diving. And over many years, he became very familiar with the kelp forests off this coast. And in 2014, 2015, when we had the heat wave off of our coast, and of course the sea star wasting disease, Brian was really concerned because the kelp forests that he had been visiting so many times over the years were decimated. And that, from what I understand, is what inspired him to do this research, to try to restore kelp forest habitat. And so Brian now is doing his doctorate degree, and I'm sure he'll tell you a lot more about that over the evening. So, and the last thing I want to say is, in looking at your videos and your papers, you really are a very enthusiastic, energetic, passionate guy, which I think is really cool. You strike me as a really cool guy. So I'm really looking forward to your talk tonight. Okay.
Well, thank you. That might be the nicest introduction I've ever gotten, so I appreciate it. Yeah, and I'm really happy to be here and always happy to talk about kelp and kelp forests. I'm just going to share my screen here and make sure that I go on to presenter mode. All right. Cool. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about a few different things. Um, there's a whole bunch of different organizations and partners and stuff on this first slide, just because I want to start just by mentioning that I'm not just talking about my work. Everything that I'm a part of and everything that I collaborate on is, you know, only able to be done because of all of these great organizations and partnerships that we have. But really what I want to talk today about is just sort of kelp forests in general in British Columbia and, you know, looking at the status of kelp now, what's going on and has been going on over the recent past, and what's going to be happening with kelp forests in the future and sort of what we can do about that. And so I'll kind of walk you through a few different things. But let's just start off by at least making sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about kelp forests. And so in general, kelp forests are order Laminarialis. They're these big brown seaweeds that cover a whole bunch of the world shorelines in temperate environments. And so up in the northern hemisphere, as well as down in the southern hemisphere, and generally cooler waters, they make these really great 3D habitats. And it's an area about 5 times the size of all the world's coral reefs, which is just kind of an interesting stat that I hadn't really heard of until recently. So I like mentioning that, because coral reefs, I mean, we are in the Pacific Northwest. I think we're all very familiar with kelp forests, but it's really interesting, I find, when you're talking to more global audiences and they don't quite realize how important kelp is to our local ecosystems. And so to even back it up a little bit further, when we talk about kelp specifically, oftentimes on our coast, kelp forest is synonymous with 2 species, which is giant kelp and bull kelp. And that's because these are these 2 canopy forming species that come all the way up to the surface, or I should say surface canopy forming species. And they're the ones that we see when we go for a walk along the shoreline or out on the breakwater or something like that, if you're kayaking. And so that's what most people are familiar with. And so a lot of the time when we talk about kelp changes or kelp loss, people are kind of just assuming that it's just talking about the giant kelp and the bull kelp. But it's also really important to note that there are a whole array of other species that don't go quite as high up to the surface, but are also super important to our ecosystems and are still, you know, really high productivity and very valuable. And here on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, we have some of the highest diversity of kelp species in the world. I think second only to the other side of the Pacific over by Japan. And there's just an amazing array of different species and forms and shapes of really cool kelps. It's also important to note that kelp forests are globally the second most at-risk marine ecosystem to climate change. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, recently came out with a special assessment where they kind of looked at all these different nearshore habitats and marine habitats, and only second to warm water corals, kelp forests are highly vulnerable to warming oceans. Here in BC, and generally in the Pacific Northwest, our kelp forests are super productive because they're such fast-growing, you know, large structures. They are great habitat for all sorts of different fishes. There was a great paper by Anne Schaffer and her team a few years back where they were looking at preferential use of things like herring and salmon and various other forage fishes, and just found that overall these fishes that we really care about on the coast here really prefer being in bull kelp and kelp forest habitats. And it's not only just within the kelp forest themselves that's important. This is another figure from a picture by Angeline Olson and her team, where they looked at connectivity between kelp forests and other nearby ecosystems. So in this case, looking at things like kelp drifting off and going into eelgrass beds, and then that detritus in the eelgrass beds was actually working its way up the food chain and enriching things like juvenile rockfish. And so there's these really cool effects of having kelp forests locally within the kelp forest itself as habitat, but there's also really great effects just out into the surrounding environment as well. So we care. generally, what's going on with these important habitats. And instead of talking about how cool kelp forests are, I always like to start with this video to show you. So this is a video that I took a couple of years back up in the Broughton Archipelago, so sort of the north side of Vancouver Island. And you can see my hand is sort of on the left side of this. You can see just how absolutely massive these bull kelps can get. And there's my hand there. So you can just these huge canopies, really, really gorgeous, just absolutely magnificent, kind of like these underwater forests. And you can imagine just how important that type of habitat is to all the different fishes and things like that. And the other important thing to note is with the bull kelp specifically, it's an annual species. So that all of that growth happens in just 1 year, and then it dies off in the fall and winter, and then it happens all over again and comes back up the next spring, which is really impressive. And so, as Gloria mentioned, my own sort of journey in kelp forests and learning about kelp, it really started here in the Salish Sea. On my dad's side, we're Stalo, and going back generations and generations, living all around the Salish Sea, a little bit up in the Vancouver area, kind of by the Fraser River. And when I was quite young, we actually moved to the interior of BC, which is where I became a scuba diving instructor. And I had kind of moved away, gone down south, was diving on coral reefs and things like that, and ended up coming back. And my eventual wife and I ended up settling on the east side of Vancouver Island. And it was in this town called Nanaimo, and I was teaching scuba diving, and we'd go out to these rocky nearshore kind of like areas, and we'd go on these scuba dives. And every time on the way out of the dive and then coming back in to the shallows, you'd end up in just these absolutely magnificent kelp forests. And one of my favorite things to do was actually I'd kind of find a nice little like crevice in the rocks, and I'd lean back and I'd put my tank back, and I'd be looking up into the canopy and just watching fish swim around and the light shimmering down through. And it was just absolutely magical. I had loved working down in the coral reefs and in the Caribbean and things like that. But coming back and just finding this as like my real happy place was just absolutely awesome. And I eventually had decided to go back to school and get an undergraduate degree. And in the first year of my undergraduate degree, the big blob marine heat wave hit the West Coast. And so this is around 2013 technically, but really it was 2014 is when it kind of hit our coast in earnest, and going into 2015. And you can see on this map here, so here's Vancouver Island, and this warm water anomaly just really heating up in sort of the northern Salish Sea in the Strait of Georgia area. And what happened was over the course of like just 1 year, all of these kelp forests at all of my favorite dive sites just completely disappeared. And so this kind of kicked off my drive to really figure out what was going on with these amazing habitats. And during my undergraduate degree, I was lucky enough to get involved in some restoration projects. This is a video from an ROV that we were doing some restoration back in 2019. And you can see there's all these herring swimming around, and it's great, but the kelp itself is actually just bleached, dying. Compared to that last video we were looking at, you can see how the blades just kind of turn into this tissue-looking material and kind of slough off. And eventually the bull kelp just can't survive, and it actually just completely dies. And so I went on from my undergraduate degree and ended up doing a master's in remote sensing down at the University of Victoria. So using things like drones and satellites to monitor kelp forests. And after getting my master's, I decided to stay at UVic, but moving back to the biology department and doing more ecology side of things. And that's when I got involved with Dr. Julia Baum, who is my current PhD supervisor and has been a fantastic mentor along the way. And so one thing that, coming out of this experience of everybody around that I was working with, we'd all sort of witnessed these disappearances of kelp in and around the Salish Sea in certain areas. Some areas it seemed to be doing fine. And so it really raised a lot of questions of like, okay, well, what's actually going on in the rest of BC? We don't have the greatest data of sort of these broad scale trends. And we had also just sort of started this group called the Kelp Rescue Initiative. And so, you know, we were looking to do restoration, kelp restoration, but one of the things you have to know first before you can do a successful restoration is, you know, what are the different issues facing kelp in different areas of the province? And so my colleague and good friend Sam Starko had led this paper that actually just got published, like I think maybe a month and a half ago now, where we looked at sort of the status and trends of kelp forests across BC. And what we did is we took all of this sort of environmental data, kind of mashed it together, and then tried to pull together all the available kelp forest data that we could from things like, you know, aerial flights and boats and drones and scuba diving surveys and satellites, and kind of build this sort of more holistic look of what was actually happening across all these different places in British Columbia. And I think I saw Sarah Cook is on this call. And I don't know if I've actually met Sarah before, but Sarah works for Sea Change or runs Sea Change or owns Sea Change. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they're involved with Shore Zone. And so we used a lot of Shore Zone and Environment and Climate Change Canada imagery. And we kind of grouped it together into these different time frames of sort of historical, which was before the big marine heat wave, and then modern after the blob marine heat wave, to sort of look at this kind of comparison of how recently these kelp ecosystems had been changing. And since this made up a large portion of the analysis for this paper, and since the imagery that we take is kind of from this oblique angle where it's basically out the side of your helicopter as you're flying along the coastline, we weren't able to actually say, you know, here's the percent change in kelp area, because you kind of have to have this like above view to actually do that, like you have with, say, a satellite or an airplane. And so instead, we just looked at loss, stability, and gain as like loss would be complete loss, like extirpation from that one little shoreline segment. Stable would be more, even if kelp went up or down in the area, as long as there was some kelp before and some kelp after, we would still say it was stable. So there could be literally one bull kelp bulb sitting at the surface, and we'd still say it was stable. So you can imagine that we're probably, in some cases, potentially underestimating the amount of kelp loss, because this is just looking at extirpation from these little segments. And then same thing with gain. It's like if you were only going from 0 kelp to any amount of kelp afterwards. And just to give you sort of a sense of what this looks like from this type of imagery, you can see this is kind of an example of areas that either had kelp and then it was lost. And often it's quite clear, you know, what is going on in those systems. And my understanding is that they fly these flights specifically at low tide because generally they're looking at the whole nearshore sort of intertidal habitat. So that's great for capturing surface canopy forming kelp. And so, as you can imagine, across this super heterogeneous coastline, we have a whole bunch of different trends going on in different regions. And I'm going to kind of go in and break these down a little bit, and chat about some of the different things that we're seeing here. And I'll start with kind of the southern region. So down in the Salish Sea, there's really variable trends that we saw sort of within our kind of local area here around Victoria and a little bit further north. And it seems like a lot of that is very highly correlated with temperature, which is not really a huge surprise. It's kind of what we had expected and sort of had seen firsthand when a lot of these losses were actually happening. And you can see kind of on these maps. So here's a map of southern Vancouver Island. And up in sort of the Strait of Georgia area on the northern side of these islands that are a little more exposed to this warm water mass is where you see a lot of the kelp loss. And then as you start moving down, kind of even just on the other side of the island, in some cases, there's a bit colder water. Things seem a little bit more stable. And then as you go out into the Juan de Fuca, you know, you get these big stretches of coastline with very, very stable kelp. And it isn't until you sort of turn the corner and start heading back up into Barkley Sound that you start seeing those losses again as it warms up a little bit. And another thing that we were able to do in this paper, which I was really excited about, is these green dots here actually represent two scuba time series that we were able to put together. So one of them is from our friends up at Hornby Island Divers, and they were co-authors on the paper. And we work closely with them at Kelp Rescue. And the other is actually a whole bunch of old videos and photos and things that I was able to put together from my old dive shop at Sundown Diving in Nanaimo, if you ever get the chance to go there. Great shop. Ed's always a fantastic guy to work with. And so one of the things we took, like a friend of mine had a hard drive of just all these old GoPro videos. And I went through all these old videos and put together a time series of whether or not there was kelp at this certain site. And then we were able to put that together to show that it was distinctly during that blob heat wave that kelp was lost. And we saw similar patterns in Barkley Sound. This map on the right here is actually from another paper that Sam had led that I was a part of, that came out a couple of years back now, that looked at losses in Barkley Sound, and very similar trends of, that pretty high kelp cover, and then during that big heat wave is when things really kind of bounced back down and haven't quite recovered very well since. But that's not the only thing that's happening on our coast and has been happening on our coast. You may recall that soon after this sort of heat wave had started, and technically actually before the heat wave had started, this sea star wasting disease had broke out. And I think it started in 2013, I believe. But it really was exacerbated by the heat that hit our coast. And so within about a year or so, there was just absolutely massive outbreaks of the sea star wasting disease. Billions of sea stars. I believe it was the largest zoonotic event ever recorded, where these sea stars, ranging from our ochre stars up in the intertidal to these big Pycnopodia sunflower stars in the subtidal, all completely wasted away. These populations were just decimated in some areas and still haven't come back in some of those areas. And what that led to was these sort of trophic cascades, where in areas where you saw the loss of this predator, the sunflower star, you would also see a rise in urchins. And so we get these things called urchin barrens. And one area that we noticed a lot of these urchin barrens very, very intensely was up in northern BC. And so the water temperature doesn't get quite as hot up in that area of northern BC, but what we did notice is on the backside of some of these islands, you would get these sort of less exposed channels and things like that. And you would have these urchins coming basically right up into the intertidal. And I'll zoom in a little bit just so you can kind of get the scale of some of this, the scale of some of these urchin barrens. And I've actually never seen personally, in person, seen urchins actually above the intertidal line of water. So obviously it seems like probably the tide was receding faster than the urchins could actually get back down. But I mean, you can tell that everything's just completely bare below the water line, which is quite an impressive feat. And you can imagine what kind of an effect that would have on the local ecosystems as well. When you're just losing all the productivity, basically, of the local kelps and seaweeds and things like that. And so from these two areas, there's kind of these two key drivers that are emerging. But it's also really important to note that these trophic interactions and these sort of temperature-related things, they often overlap as well. So it's not this clear-cut picture of, oh, well, in this area, this is happening, in that area, this is happening. A lot of it's happening in different areas. Those are just good examples of kind of where they're quite distinct. But along the BC coast, it's not quite as cut and dry. And you can go into a lot of places where you have both of these things and more happening. And so a good example of that is, I mentioned that research we had done in Barkley Sound. And this is an ROV video that from a ROV flight that I did, where we were looking at kind of the urchins and kelp in Barkley Sound. And you can see these really strong urchin barrens. And then as you kind of come up into the shallows, If you look at the top right corner of the screen, you can see we're only in like 1.5, 1.4 meters, slowly going up and up. And so just up the upper intertidal, or upper subtidal, I should say, you get these areas where the kelp is actually getting washed around enough, and there's big enough waves that it kind of keeps the urchins at bay a little bit, and the kelp is able to survive. But then as we went back further into Barkley Sound, the water warms up, and that top layer, that fringe of kelp that was surviving, no longer has quite as much wave action, and also is getting warmer and is dying off. And so we have multiple stressors going on, but there was this one area in sort of central BC that looked quite stable and actually had the most gains of any of the other regions, which kind of raised the question, okay, so what is actually going on here in this one little pocket of BC? And even though I say a little pocket, I mean, this is a pretty big stretch. You've got two outer Vancouver Island sites, and then one sort of up towards the central coast. And I had mentioned that, sunflower stars are these predators of urchins, but obviously they're not the only thing that eats urchins. We also have sea otters. And so in these systems, when you have both sea otters and sunflower stars feeding on urchins, something we call functional redundancy, which means that if you lose one of them, the other one can still technically do the job. And most of the coast, we've actually lost our sea otters. They were hunted to extirpation quite a long time ago for a fur trade. But in the early 1970s, they were actually reintroduced near Cayuquet-Checklisset Bay on the coast of Vancouver Island, and have since then been expanding in their range quite dramatically. And so this is just a figure from a DFO report that came out a few years back, kind of showing the current distribution of sea otters, and it matches up quite nicely with our sort of resilient and even gain areas of kelp. And it seems like kind of like a nice, slightly happy ending to the story, aside from, there are quite a few concerns, especially with local First Nations and community groups around things like food security, because although these otters kind of make these nice resilient kelp forests, they also eat a lot. And so there are definitely concerns. It's not just like, hey, whatever, we'll bring, otters all around the coast and just let them do their thing, because there are rural communities that really rely on the food that they take from the ocean. And so if you lose that, you can see a lot of problems. So we know that kelp forests are threatened across BC, but then the big question becomes, what do we do about it? And I think this is, as an ecologist, a really important question, in the current age of climate change and all the anthropogenic stressors, that it's not really enough for us as ecologists and biologists to just study what's happening and watch everything crash and burn, because, we've been doing that for years. We know things are bad, and we need to actually try to help do something about it, because we're some of the most educated people to actually be able to do something about it. And so that's kind of a lot of what led to the Kelp Rescue Initiative, which is this group of scientists that I'm a part of. It's based out of the Bamfield Marine Science Center, but we've got various partner organizations, and we work closely with First Nations in different parts of sort of southern BC right now. And we have all these scientists who specialize in these different aspects of things like genomics or, modeling of different things. And we're working on a lot of restoration research and doing all sorts of field surveys and experiments and things like that. And a lot of this, really the ultimate goal is generally to be supporting Indigenous stewardship. So, anywhere you go on the coast, you're on First Nations territory somewhere, or multiple First Nations territories. And so, as these like small scientific organizations, and we don't really think that it's our job to go out and restore kelp in all these places, but we have a lot of conversations with First Nations who are maybe part of the MAP partnership or various other partnerships along the coast, where they're out there monitoring their kelp forests. They're watching them slowly disappear, or sometimes quickly disappear, and they want to do something about it. But kelp restoration is tricky, and it takes a lot of trial and error, and it's very prescriptive to specific instances and locations. And so one of our jobs as scientists, I think, is to kind of make sure that we're putting all the right tools as easily as possible into these different groups' hands so that they can kind of take that forward and take the next steps without having to sink, hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in some cases into their own research to start from scratch. And so before I get going on talking about some of our projects within the Kelp Rescue Initiative, I just want to back it up a little bit again and talk about the kelp life cycle, because it is a little bit complex. Kelps are not actually plants. They're technically, well, not technically actually, they're protists. And so they have sort of a weird reproduction and life cycle. So they go from the sporophyte, which is the big, planty bit that we see, the seaweed that we're familiar with that's floating up at the surface. We'll just call that the adult kelp. And those sporophytes will drop patches of sori, which have little spores, and those spores will land somewhere on the rocky bottom as little microscopic, tiny little spores. Those will sit there over the winter, and then they'll eventually turn into either male or female gametophytes. And then the male gametophyte at some point over the winter and into the spring will send off its little sperm and actually fertilize the female gametophyte's eggs, and then those will start to grow as microscopic sporophytes. So then you've sort of completed your life cycle, and you have these tiny, tiny little, I'll show a picture of what they look like in a minute, but then they start to grow into the spring and come back up as a larger adult sporophyte. And so in kelp restoration, one of the main techniques that we're using right now is to go out, capture these spores, and then let them grow in the lab as gametophytes. And so, you give them the right amount of nutrients and light, and you kind of keep tumbling them around. And then when when you're ready to do some outplanting, you take them, you actually dump them into like a magic bullet or some blender. You zap them a few times and break them up into a million pieces. And then all we actually do is just stick them in like a spray bottle, and you can actually just spray them onto different things of whatever you want to put out into the environment. And so we've been experimenting in the past with something called green gravel. So just putting them on little rocks that you can go put out into the ocean. Also things like tiles, and the classic way of doing it is like seeded lines on string. You can keep that up off of the bottom. And we're doing a few different things. There's actually, we have one person who's actually experimenting with something we're calling gameto glue, Maisie Roy Musar. They're fantastic, and they basically invented this sort of agar glue that you can actually put the gametophytes into and then squeeze it out underneath the water onto substrates. So all sorts of different things that we're trialing right now. There's not really a magic bullet, it seems, at this point, but hopefully we're getting some cool results in different areas. And so this is what that kelp starts to look like when it's still quite small. These are the little, once they start growing as sporophytes, so you can kind of see the blades starting to come up. And then they get a little bit bigger and they start differentiating. You can even see some tiny little bulbs just barely starting right over here. And each kelp kind of just has one big blade before those start to split. And then as they keep growing, they get bigger and bigger. And this, I just changed species. Now we're looking at macrocystis, but you get the idea. Basically, you can put these substrates out, and now they're growing up to the surface. But it's obviously not quite that simple, because the kelp was lost for some reason to begin with in these areas, right? And so we need to be cognizant of that, and you need to address the stressors that originally got rid of the kelp before you can actually really bring it back successfully. And so one thing that helps with that is kind of doing taking the time, doing the research on how to build better baselines of where exactly did kelp used to be, and what are areas that we should at least be targeting, knowing that this used to be a big kelp forest or something like that. And so this is part of what I'm doing right now for my PhD, and have been working on over the past year or so, using this data that I had found in the University of Victoria archives. And basically this data came from, there's this guy named Alan Austin, who used to be a prof at UVic. And he had gotten a contract from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to go out and map the red seaweed that we now call Masiella splendens along the coast of sort of eastern Vancouver Island, in the northern section of the Salish Sea up in the Strait of Georgia. And so they went out and they flew these planes, and they actually collected two types or multiple types of imagery. One of those was just regular, like kind of RGB, the same normal photos that you would take with the camera. And one of them was near infrared imagery. And so you get this nice glow of the vegetation. This red that you see down here is anything that's some sort of vegetation. It's going to bounce the near infrared light off, and it's going to glow nice and bright. So you can definitely tell that that's what it is, which is important because often from these sort of higher up areas, it's kind of hard to tell if something is just like muddy or silty, or is it actually a seaweed or what, right? And so that glow really helps. And so they took this data and a bunch of ground truthing data, and they kind of built these maps along the coastline. Again, from Denman Island all the way up to Quadra Island. This is up by Campbell River. This is down at Deep Bay, if some of you have maybe been to like the Deep Bay Marine Field Station. And they built these really cool maps that showed all the different kind of seaweed communities, but really importantly, and this isn't what they were looking for, but they note in their paper like, hey, we can also see a whole bunch of bull kelp in this area. And this is an area that, you talk to the locals and they'll all tell you, oh yeah, there used to be these big bull kelp forests here. But it was so common and it was everywhere that nobody really had thought to like, hey, maybe we should, take detailed notes of where this all is before it was gone. And so we went out with the Hakai Institute, who's has been a fantastic partner. I work really closely with Luba Rashitnik from Hakai during my master's and continue to work with her now. And we also got funding from National Geographic and the Trebek Initiative. So that really helped us to actually, push this project forward before it was kind of just this pipe dream. And we also got some great support from like the Banfield Marine Field Station. Everybody pitched in. It was fantastic. And we went out and we mapped that same area that they had mapped 50 years prior, so a half a century before. And we used the exact same type of imagery as well. So we had regular photos as well as near infrared sensors. And then my team and I went out and did a bunch of ground truthing. We spent a whole bunch of time in the intertidal and the shallow subtidal, kind of snorkeling around, doing transects and quadrats. And I did a whole bunch of scuba diving as well, just seeing, what was going on in these areas that used to have these big kelp forests, and what was the community looking like at the bottom. And the overall takeaway here was that there were these massive, massive areas that used to be these just kelp beds as far as the eye can see. And if you look at the scale on some of these, like this is 1-2 kilometers, and you can just imagine just the size of some of these kelp beds and how cool it would have been to see them back in their prime. And what we found was that in this area, this region of the Salish Sea that we knew had been heating up quite drastically, about 97% of the kelp, the bull kelp, or almost 550 hectares, had been lost completely. And I personally, every year, there's like forest fires, and they'll talk about how big in hectares this forest fire is, and I'm always like, I have no idea. I don't work in hectares ever. And so just to kind of give it some context, this is an area about twice the size of Stanley Park in Vancouver. If you've been to Vancouver, it's almost 3 times, I think, the size of like Central Park in New York City. So it's quite a massive area that, if this was a regular forest that had just disappeared, people would be probably quite upset about it. And we can go back in time using various data sets to kind of look at some of the timing of when this had happened. So a lot of the losses that I talked about earlier in the other paper that we just put out, these were all based on this big blob heat wave. And we even had that one scuba survey from our friends on Hornby Island showing that this one kelp bed had disappeared during the blob heat wave. But that was a tiny, tiny little kelp bed that they were sort of like keeping an eye on because it was sort of the last one in the area. And these were massive, absolutely massive kelp beds. And so when we look back in time, we can use like the government has these great lighthouse sort of sea surface temperature records, one from the southern tip of Denman and one a bit further down by Nanaimo, but there's quite similar kind of oceanographic patterns of heat there. And you can see that, so this is the 70s, 72 is when this imagery is collected. And what we're looking at here is days above 18 degrees Celsius and days above 20 degrees Celsius. And so the pink is the 18, the purple is the 20, and then there's the count on your y-axis here going across these years. And you can see this sort of general trend going back in time where there wasn't that many hot days, but then they'd come, you get a few hot years and then cool years, hot years, cool years. But over the last few decades, it's just been boiling pretty much every single year, getting above 18 degrees. And those are important temperatures because that's when different stages of the kelp life cycle start failing completely. And so usually around like 18 is when those spores that I was talking about just start bursting. They just die. They explode as tiny little microscopic explosions. And they don't continue that life cycle, which is important when you have an annual species like bull kelp, because every single year it kind of starts from scratch and it all has to grow up. And also those spores are dropping from the surface, which is usually the hottest bit of the water. And so then you can see there's kind of there's some years in the 70s that have a little bit of warm water here and there, but then you hit the late 70s and you get these two just massive spikes, as well as some of the highest days over 20 degrees. And we suspect that that's probably the nail in the coffin for a lot of these kelp beds. Oop. There we go. And so what you go from is something that looks probably quite a bit like this nice sort of very kelpy environment, to this is just a screenshot from an ROV survey that we were doing last year, where you can still see some brown down there. There's some kelp, but it's not quite the same. There's a lot more red seaweeds taking over. There's a lot more green, like ulva, taking over. It's a bit more weedy. And the community composition is just generally changing. It's just not as productive anymore. And so if we want to do restoration in an area like this, like I said, we have to be very cognizant of, the actual ongoing stressors, what's going on. And so, this is an area that has gotten hot and is remaining hot. And so if we're going to do something about it with kelp, there are some groups out there that are working on things like genomics and trying to like make more resilient kelp. That's not really something we're doing at Kelp Rescue. But we are thinking about time of the year. So if you outplant the kelp and it grows to the surface, you're still at least getting a certain time of year where the kelp is there and hopefully fulfilling its role in the ecosystem. And then you also need to make sure, since you have to do that every year, you have to make sure that you can do it at scale, on a large enough scale that it's ecologically relevant, and making sure that that's also cost effective, because you don't want to just be throwing, thousands and thousands of dollars down the drain just to make some kelps pop up for a few months of the year, especially if it's not actually doing anything. And so we have various other projects going on within the Kelp Rescue Initiative. There's a lot of genomics work, admittedly very outside of my wheelhouse. I am by no means a geneticist, but there's some great work going on in various labs here in BC where they're doing kind of genome sequencing and looking at populations that do better or worse. So not necessarily changing genes, but taking different populations and growing them under different conditions and seeing which ones kind of do better. And then we're also doing a lot of different restoration methods. So Dr. Lauren Dykman is a postdoc in the BOM lab who I work closely with, and she's fantastic. And she's kind of organizing all these different experiments on how we can get this kelp out to the bottom of the ocean so that it can grow, and how to keep the urchins away from it, especially, which is a big challenge in a lot of areas. And tomorrow, actually, I'm heading up for the second round of field work up in that Comox area that I was just sort of showing you the maps of. And we're monitoring, doing a whole year of sort of pre-restoration monitoring there, so that when we do restoration in the future, we can have this nice baseline and look and see what kind of fish communities are actually using that restoration habitat to make sure that it's actually worth, the time and effort to go through to put that kelp back out there year after year if we're in these areas where it's going to stay quite hot for some time. And so the idea is to kind of take all of these things, mash them together, and sort of build this blueprint for kelp restoration that we can then sort of hand off to other community groups. We're not in the business of looking to do all the restoration for everybody on the coast, but what we want to do is to be there in a supportive role so that when a community group or a First Nation wants to do that restoration, we can say, hey, we've spent all the time and effort, figuring out these nitty-gritty details. So like, here are some options, here are some training videos, you can take this and run with it, and we'll be there to support you along the way. And culturing these kelps so that it's easy to get the seed out to the groups that need them. And none of this would be possible without, again, I mentioned all the fantastic partners and sponsorships and groups that we work with. So huge thank you to all of them. If I'm not super active on Twitter these days, I guess, but I haven't even updated this slide to say X yet. But you can follow me if you would like to hear more about Kelpie stuff, or shoot me an email, briantimmer@uvic.ca. Always happy to chat more about kelp. And yeah, that's all I got. I'm happy to take any questions if people have some, or just generally chat.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was so informative and interesting. I grew up in the California kelp beds, the macrocystis beds, and so it was just so interesting to me to see all the changes that are happening up here. And we will open the floor for questions. If anyone has a question, a comment, they just want to chat, you can either feel free to unmute yourself and ask over the camera, or you can type it into the chat and I will facilitate that for you.
Anne.
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for a fantastic talk. Very, very interesting. So I live on Thetis Island, and this is the second year that a small diving group has been working with Louis Druel's lab at Bamfield and funded by Oceanwise, two small sites that we've been doing kelp outplantings on lines, but also green gravel. And last year we had pretty good success with growth of the adult sporophytes to the surface, and everything was destroyed by kelp crabs. And we're trying to figure out ways to stop them from getting up there, but any ideas?
Yeah, interesting. So we haven't run into too many kelp crab problems yet, but I do know that that's a big issue. They were doing restoration down in Seattle, I believe, and they were running into some really big kelp crab issues. And way back when I was an undergraduate and doing some kelp restoration, we did some transplants, and we did it on lines to keep it off the bottom so the urchins wouldn't get it, and the kelp crabs marched right up and would go up, and they'd pick holes in the bulbs, and then the bulbs would sink, and then the urchins would devour everything. And yeah, it's a great question. I honestly don't know, and I don't know if anybody knows yet. But I mean, to me, it sounds like another one of those sort of like trophic interaction type things. And I've had this kind of back of my pocket hypothesis that there's this area around Victoria that I do intertidal surveys at for this other project that I work on. And I often see, so the seagulls come in, there's kelp beds sort of around this like big rocky outcrop. And every time I go out and I'm walking across this outcrop, and I find just dead kelp crabs everywhere because the seagulls and seabirds are coming in, eating them, like assumedly off the top of the kelp and bringing them back up and eating them. So I wonder if it's, I mean, that's a long shot. It's probably more than just birds, but like it seems to me like that's probably the thing going on is that there's some sort of trophic imbalance. Maybe it's fishing pressure where we're missing some, big species of rockfish or lingcod or something like that. I'm not too sure, but that sounds highly suspicious like that's the type of thing that
Yeah.
would be going.
I mean, it was literally hundreds of them. We had the
Mhm.
bins just full of kelp crabs that one of the divers had picked off them. And it was almost like there had been no bull kelp around, and we planted some bull kelp, and it was like, hey, we've set
Yeah,
the table. Here we
totally.
come. Is there anything, any innovative ways that are being used for the urchins?
So far, a lot of the urchin work seems to be very nothing I would say that's super new and innovative. I think that the coolest thing that I know of is that down at Friday Harbor Labs right now, there's a group that's actually they're growing Pycnopodia in like cultures, and so that they can hopefully like outplant them at certain sites and go put Pycnopodia back into areas that they have been missing from for a few years. But my understanding is that also once they get to a certain size, generally they're still like being affected by the same wasting disease, and so they only get so big before they kind of die off. Within our group, a lot of the stuff we're doing is still fairly small scale, and so things like urchin fences and cages just for small areas to keep them out, so you can at least get little clusters of kelp, sort of like in patchworks. But from what I've seen, the only thing that's actually successful, there's that study that Lynn Lee led up in Haida Gwaii a few years back. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but they basically enlisted commercial urchin harvesters to go in and do a mix of just smashing and harvesting of urchins. And it worked really, really well for a year. And then they left it. And then the next year, the urchins came right back in, is my understanding. So it seems like a really tough hill to climb to deal with. But on the bright side, I think there is that if you can muster up the human power to actually keep that sort of stewardship aspect in play of maintaining those areas, usually those are the colder areas as well that the kelp can actually grow quite nicely, is where the urchins are. So bit of a tricky one.
I have one more question.
Yeah, totally.
So this year has been sort of record-breaking ocean temperatures, and future, it seems like the prediction is just going to be getting worse. Is there any promising work in the kind of genetic field of maybe species or that are sort of less susceptible to heat?
Yeah, good question. So I know that right now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Patrick Martone in his lab, but he's a fantastic phycologist over on the mainland. I'm sure Louis knows him quite well. And he has been doing, my understanding is doing kind of more like heat shock treatments with like gametophyte stages and sporophyte stages to see if they can kind of speed up that selection process a little bit more to get the really, really highly resilient kelp. So like we at Kelp Rescue, we've been doing it a bit more passively, where we take different populations from warmer and colder areas and like watch to see how they grow, but they're actively putting stress onto some of these populations and then watching to see if they can survive a bit better. So I know that they're working on that. I haven't heard at all how it's going, to be honest. And I'm not aware of anybody, at least on our neck of the woods, at least, who's doing like actively trying to do any sort of gene editing. I don't know. Again, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't know if that's just like a pie in the sky thing that no one's even close to right now, or if it just takes a bit of willpower and some money to get it done. But I think everyone's pretty precautionary, keeping the precautionary principle in mind of like nobody wants to unleash some weird super kelp that takes over and then dies in a disease 3 years later, right? So
yeah, unintended consequences, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that seems to go poor for us as humans, I think, a lot of the time. So, but I think there's also an interesting thing to be said about just like replacement species, and in some of these areas, like in the Salish Sea, there's a lot of sargassum, and it's an invasive species. But it also forms this huge, massive canopies in various areas of the Salish Sea. And so, it doesn't quite overlap perfectly, I think, with like where bull kelp would always be found. It doesn't do very well in high currents or that well in really, really high action, wave action like bull kelp does. But to my knowledge, there isn't a lot of literature out there about, whether or not that's actually technically kind of beneficial in an area that you've lost your bull kelp, or maybe not so much. I'm not too sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get a few more studies like that coming out soon that that sort of look at those replacements of similar species that are still productive and still forming habitat. But yeah, I think that's some interesting work hopefully to come.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And if you there's a researcher down in Washington State who I know has been focused a lot on kelp crabs. And I cannot for the life of me remember her name off the top of my head, but if you shoot me an email, I'd be happy to figure out what her name is when I remember it and let you know and try and put you guys in contact if that's helpful.
Yeah, I see Amy McConnell's on this call too, and we're working with her from out of Bamfield. So
Nice.
yeah, thanks.
I have a couple questions or comments. I'm just wondering, you mentioned the kelp crabs. I live on the Soup Basin here, and boy, I know that there's a heck of a lot of European green crabs out there. I would imagine that they would be really aggressive at destroying certainly the small kelp and seaweeds, because they're very aggressive at the eelgrass out here. And my other question has to do with, you mentioned the Nam geese, First Nation being involved with restoration. And I was just wondering, I know the Nam geese, the Kwakwaka'wakw, have been really very pro-environment for many, many years. And like they really fought the fish farms as one example. So I'm just wondering, what is it that, like you mentioned, community groups like the Nam geese, like, do they have graduate students that are First Nations up there, or like how is it that they're involved?
Yeah, good question. So for the first one with the green crabs, admittedly, I don't know a ton about green crabs aside from that they're now in the Souk Basin in recent years and have been moving into different parts of the Salish Sea. My understanding, though, is that they're aren't as often in the more rocky outcroppy areas that are super kelpy. And so that's why they're such a threat to eelgrass, but definitely would, I'm sure they go to town when they find some kelp in those kind of like more sedimenty environments. But I don't think that they're necessarily like invading the rocky intertidal. Not that I've heard of, at least. It'll be interesting to see as that spreads. And I'm woefully underinformed on how that's going on the rest of the coast where they've been in this more kelpy environment. So that would be an interesting thing to look at. For the second question, so it sort of depends. I mean, you know, every situation is different, and a lot of the setbacks that various community groups and First Nations have are often around capacity. And so there's this thing called the Guardians program, where a bunch of different First Nations along the coast are doing a whole bunch, like just an amazing amount of work doing monitoring, you know, eelgrass and monitoring kelps and doing all sorts of other things. And so a lot of the time they're out there, you know, collecting that data and sort of like building these sort of data repositories that can sometimes be shared between nations with different data partnerships. But then also there's often support coming from places like UVic. And so, for example, up in the Broughtons, where the Broughton Aquaculture Transition Initiative is the group of First Nations that kind of got together and said, hey, we're going to get rid of these fish farms from this area. And after being successful, they were like, okay, well, now what? So like, let's start looking at, you know, doing some look at our kelp ecosystems, because those are in decline up here. And so a postdoctoral researcher from the old lab that I actually did my master's in, who was associated with Kelp Rescue as well, she's gone up and done a whole bunch of work doing surveys and things and helping with working together with the Guardian team. And so they're kind of putting a lot of those pieces together, and then often it'll end up being you know, a researcher from some lab at UVic or SFU or where have you that, you know, maybe does the final like data collation and writes a paper about it or something like that. But then also that information is like given back to the community, and there's always, you know, real good interaction to make sure that the needs of the community are being met, and not just like taking this data and putting it into academia and spitting it out into the paper mill or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, it's different everywhere. Whenever there's a project, it's, you know, it's always important to be co-creating from the first stages of the project, where you're trying to make sure that you're meeting the needs and wants of everybody involved, instead of just being like, hey, we have this interesting question that we want to look at, and we're just going to steamroll you to go do it. So yeah, I think it's a positive, kind of a positive move that I've seen in sort of academia within BC, is that there's just so much collaboration these days, and working together on that kind of stuff.
Very cool. Anyone else have a question, either in the chat or on the screen? I think that sounds like we're good to go. I think that's a wonderful place to end for tonight. We will be posting a recording of this talk on the NAME website, and I will email out the link to that to all of the participants. And we really do thank you, Brian, for your time, for sharing all of your expertise with us tonight. And I thank everyone for joining us. As Gloria mentioned, our next talk was scheduled for June, but we're going to move on. Our next talk will be in October. The registration is available now for that one. And we also do hope to see everyone at our conference coming up in BC, in Metchosin, just outside of Victoria, in August. And that information is also on the NAME website. So hope to see some of you guys in August. Nice to meet you, Brian, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.